Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you. Yes, I was up until about 2 o'clock talking to my American colleagues about the numbers. We'll come to that in a second. The usual rules apply. If you want these slides, do email me, ben.page@ipsos.com, and I can send them to you, and you can do whatever you like with them. And every time I come to see you, things change. Last year we had Jeremy Corbyn getting elected as the leader of the Labour Party. This year he's elected with an even bigger majority. We leave the European Union. David Cameron parts the scene. We have Boris Johnson, not as Prime Minister, but as Foreign Secretary. The Conservative Party is starting to have a sort of quiet war with itself. I was at an awards ceremony last week where Theresa May said to Boris described himself as a bit like Kim the Alsatian that belonged to Michael Heseltine's uncle or something. It had been strangled but had then been given a reprieve. And he was then back to make, as he put it, a titanic success of Brexit. You couldn't make it up, actually. George Osborne, of course, was the compere, and George just pointed out, Boris, it sank. And then our Prime Minister strode onto the stage wearing a hard hat and a high-vis jacket and proceeded to make a series of running gags. The best of, well, there were lots of them, but the best was that, Boris, you may think you've had a second life, but I do remember that dog was ultimately put doan as it has no further use. So, this is just the cabinet joshing with each other, So here we are, here we are. What an interesting year it is. So my job really is just to, I was looking at your fascinating charts, which I think are great, and there's lots of tips there of things I should talk about. But where are we really? Just to first of all remind us, lots of people are not very good at predictions. I think I tell you this every year. This is just predictions by bankers on interest rates. In May 2009, they said that by 2011, they'd be over 3%. In May 2011, they said interest rates would be over 3%. You can go on. In fact, interest rates are probably going to start rising fairly soon, because they must be right eventually. So predicting things... Predicting things isn't always easy, as we know. So where are we? I think, obviously, we are obsessed about how we're going to leave the European Union. Are there any... Does anybody in here want a hard Brexit? Can I see any fans of the... Just get out and get on with it. World Trade Organization, OK? The soft Brexit? Anybody sort of soft Brexiteers? A bit of a single market access, and OK. The long Brexit? Okay, well, actually, I think we're probably going to have the long Brexit. We're going to be at this for ages, and the judges are trying to help us with that. So, where are we? Consumer confidence. Now, of course, one of the reasons George Osborne isn't Chancellor of the Exchequer anymore is some of his doom-laden predictions about what was going to happen as a result of Brexit, or might happen as a result of Brexit. And it may be one of the reasons that Mark Carney isn't staying quite as long as anticipated. Now, in every month, in the first 3 months after the referendum, each successive month, consumer confidence rose after the shock. But last month, consumers heard that Marmite might cost more. Suddenly, they alerted to the possibility of inflation, and consumer confidence fell about 28 points in October. So we don't know what's going to happen. It's worth reminding ourselves that when you look at the long run, for much of the early part of this century, during what Gordon Brown liked to describe as the longest period of growth in Britain, the consumers were endlessly telling us that the economy was going to get worse next year, and it didn't. So, maybe they're wrong, but they're certainly worried. 67% of people now say they're anxious about price rises. And I do think that if you look at the reports of organisations like the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the Resolution Foundation, and others, what you'll see, of course, is that those on the lowest income in your counties and people who are relying on state benefits are likely to see those eroded, both because they weren't going to go up with inflation anyway, and secondly, because it's very likely that food and other essentials are going to go up in cost. So we are all going to be feeling a bit worse off. On the standard of living challenge, you can see that before Brexit in May, we had 29% thought that leaving the European Union would make them worse off, and 18% thought it would make them better off. In July, that went up to 36% expecting to be worse off, and by October, it was 49%. Now, interestingly, this has hardened as well. There are a lot of course, UKIP voters in that group at the front there, but 24% do expect to be better off. Maybe they're working for exporters. or being paid in euros. But overall, people are becoming a bit more negative, and we'll see how that sort of feeds through into people's attitudes. Depreciation of the pound, 55% say it's bad for Britain. Even when I change the question wording and try and remind them that it will make it much easier to export things in future, 47% still think it's a bad thing for Britain. So we can't persuade people that devaluation of the pound, as some, a minority of finance people think, say the pound is very overvalued and now we'll be able to be very competitive. And certainly as a business that thought he was being clever by moving a lot of his back office to Romania and Bulgaria, I'm just finding out I wasn't quite so clever. But of course, actually, it wasn't about the economy. Before the referendum, the top issue, of course, we don't prompt people, was just simply the amount of migration into Britain. Now, leave aside for the fact that at the moment, and it wasn't the economy, leave aside the fact for the moment that, of course, the majority of immigrants are not from the European Union, but from other parts of the Commonwealth or relatives of immigrants already here. I think we do face some really interesting challenges. The people who voted UKIP, and there are a lot of them, the people who voted to leave, and many of them were expecting that immigration would reduce and that somehow Britain might change back into how it used to be. I think the difficulty for some of those people will be finding out that all of the people already here are here, and many will still continue to arrive. And this is the challenge at the moment. Britain remains completely split. 45% of us say the government should prioritise, above everything else, continuing access on free trade terms rather than World Trade Organization terms to the single market, but 39% want to just stop immigration. This may be hard, and so may this. And so, I don't think any of these numbers, if I am invited back to see you next year, I don't know if any of these numbers will have moved by then, but it's going to take a long time to settle this, and somebody isn't going to get what they want, probably Liam Fox. Now, obviously, in politics, you'll have noticed that Jeremy Corbyn is doing good work, or if you can actually find him anywhere at all, except at some sort of Sandinista rally. Jeremy hasn't had very much to say about anything. It's not clear whether he believes in being in the single market or not, etc. And the public have sort of spotted that. I mean, the fascinating thing is that actually, despite all of this, and for those of you who are involved in politics, I find it fascinating, despite Jeremy's complete incompetence, we still have 23% of the population who say he'd make a great Prime Minister. Now, that does compare to 53% for Theresa May. But at the moment, the Conservatives are about 18 percentage points ahead in the polls. If there is a snap election, either this year or maybe in May next year, undoubtedly the Conservatives will win by some margin. And of course, a lot of Labour MPs, when we talk to them privately, are just saying, bring it on and end the pain. So, really, if the Conservative Party was sensible, you would just wait until, the boundaries have shifted. They have been, if you're a Conservative politician, the boundaries in this country and of the constituencies have been weighted against you since the 1960s. In the 1950s, it actually went the other way around, but since the 1960s, the boundaries have tended to favour Labour. It's got more out of kilter, and so, something has to happen on that. And with Jeremy still as leader of the Labour Party and unlikely to change his style, it looks pretty likely that we can, take a Conservative victory for granted, unless, there is a massive falling out inside the Conservative Party over the betrayal of Brexit or something else, but we will see. I think the bottom line is actually, our economy is still one of the biggest in the world. We're still one of the largest manufacturers of cars in the world. You name it. Nothing much has actually really changed. But I think this sense of uncertainty that we felt, indeed an unease that a large proportion of Britons felt before the referendum, of course, if anything, has now exacerbated. And, it's fascinating. This is a chart looking at how many people in this country have got central heating or a washing machine. Now, there's a few people in this room who weren't born in 1975, but most of us were, unfortunately. And what we can say, only 43% of people even had central heating in 1970. Most of us were not, we had fires. Washing machines only at 71%. So we are infinitely still better off than in the long run, as a historian, very recent past. But we're very worried about the future. 3/4 of us say the world is changing too fast. We don't like the way it's changing. We believe that 1/4 of the population of this country are Muslims. That's what we believe. I ask people how many Muslims there are in Britain. 1/4 of the population are Muslims. That's 5%. We believe that 31% of the population are immigrants. Only a third of people on this little island have not been born here. The figure, even with illegal immigration, is probably only half that, 15%. But we're just worried. And because of that, one thing that we see all over the world, and sorry, my labels have gone a little bit funny, we're just about here somewhere, 53. We tend to believe that we'd like the country to be the way it used to be. America is repeatedly at the top of this table. They want Jim Crow, segregation, I don't know, you name it. I don't know what they want, but they want it to be different. Only the Chinese and the Swedes down here are sort of, I don't know, happy with the way things are now, maybe. And because of that, there are reasons to worry about what might happen. He's very statesman-like, isn't he? Now, this is a man who believes that you can do all sorts of things. Some of the things I really can't repeat at the County Council's Network Annual Conference. The trial that he's been arraigned in for rape has been cancelled at the last minute, in the same way that dodgy Hillary's emails have been decided to be okay. These are two of the most unpopular candidates for leader of the free world there have ever been. Our final poll tells us that maybe we shouldn't worry. My American colleagues have Hillary about 4 percentage points ahead. On the other hand, some of you will remember that in June I had Remain 4 points ahead. But this is the average error of the American pollsters. Now, the good thing about American polling, and I'm very jealous of them, is that whereas we do our final poll for the Evening Standard on a budget of about £8,000, the Americans, my American colleagues, have so far been given £8 million to spend on opinion polling during this referendum. The samples are much, much larger, and therefore our final poll in America, whereas our final poll in Britain in June had 1,000 people, my American colleagues' final poll has 29,000 people in the sample in order to look at the race in the states. And those of you who are staying up this evening, pay close attention. Florida, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, those few places that Hillary will need to take in order to cross the line and win in the Electoral College. But the American pollsters do actually have a reasonably good track record, so maybe we won't worry too much. But anyway, what's interesting, I think, in all of this, in both Britain and North America, is the stuff that's pushing, in some ways, Trump, Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, or indeed Nigel Farage. And it is, this sense that, which is very prevalent, whatever your politics, that our kids are going to be worse off than our parents. And that has really, really hardened in the last 12 years. Back in 2004, only about 16% of people said that they were going to be worse off than their parents. In Britain today, 53% of people say, I am going to ultimately be worse off than my parents. I'm not going to have that quality of life that I saw my parents getting a nice house, buying their own house, going on holiday to Spain every year, having a car and a pension to retire on, etc. It isn't, they don't believe it's going to happen. Couple that with not liking government. We're not quite as anti-government as we'll see in a minute. And in fact, your ratings, if anything, are holding up incredibly well, given the financial pressures that you're under. But certainly anti-immigration. We just did a poll across the world in September, and we asked 23 countries, all of the G20 plus a few others, to name spontaneously the biggest problem. And do you know which country on earth is most concerned about the control of immigration? This one. Not Turkey, with 3 million Syrians camped out in it, but this one. We are most worried about it, the control of immigration globally. That's it, end of. And so America's very similar. America, the number one problem in America, a huge and largely safe country, as long as you don't meet any of your neighbors carrying a gun, is actually terrorism. They are terrified of terrorism. Now, in Europe, the French and the Germans are very worried about terrorism, but they have a lot more recent experience of it than North America. But these things altogether are the things, this sort of, and then there are some religious stuff that we don't do in Britain, the anti-abortion thing and some of the authoritarian. But all of those things together drove Trump to victory. And, whatever we hear about him, however disreputable he may be, however unpresidential he may be, he is still going to get a very large proportion of Americans voting for him today. And it's, there is still a 30% chance that Donald Trump will be president tomorrow. 30% chance, I'd say. So we'll see. Now, over here, obviously things are fine. Nothing exciting here. What do we want to happen? Number one priorities. Top of the list, healthcare. And then we have things like education. This is at the national level. At a local level, they just want these things. And it's quite funny. 14% say you should have more money. I thought that was rather nice. I mean, they don't mean pay more taxes, but you know, so just go and find some more money somewhere. But interesting. I was fascinated to see public transport coming out so highly. Hospitals I might have spotted, and then our old favourites. And I've been told not to mention any individual county councils, so I won't on this. But road maintenance, street cleaning, the public realm is here for you, I guess. Interestingly, we've got looking after young kids and services for the young. Care of the elderly, of course, that slow-ticking time bomb that virtually every family in Britain is either part of or is going to be part of, it doesn't come up spontaneously. And, this is something where I had been expecting since the beginning of this century to see the emergence of the pensioners' party. Now, it may be that the triple lock, the fact that incomes for pensioners are now higher on average than for working people in terms of disposable income, that means that that's perhaps why it's not there. But certainly there is no sign of intergenerational tension. We are becoming more worried about the health service, and we would like it to have a bit more money. And this actually shows up in some other questions. Interestingly, people are still not noticing austerity, and I think that just shows the balancing act that you have achieved over the last 6 years. So we've got, back in 2012, we had 33% who said they'd been affected a great deal by spending cuts to reduce the deficit. Today, it's 27%, 4 years later. Now, of course, we've delayed paying off the deficit. We're going to kick it down the road. Probably on the 23rd of November, there will be a more flexible budget. There won't be those rigid targets that George Osborne couldn't ever meet. And we'll kick the can off down the road. But nevertheless, we know, don't we, that things are going to get tougher. But the public, actually, if anything, is managing their own expectations and is reasonably cheerful. 25%, so they haven't noticed any difference at all. And interestingly, we're starting to see a shift in whether or not the government should this is cut taxes, or this is actually spend more on public services, even if it means some increases to taxes. Now, back in 1997, Tony Blair was elected. The #1 issue in Britain at that time was, again, the NHS and education. And, of course, 4 or 5 years later, money started to flow into public spending. Support for that then went down and down and down. 2009, in the recession, only 46% favouring it. Now up to 60%. Now, of course, when they say some increases to taxes, as you all know, they mean other people's taxes. But nevertheless, it is interesting to see if that pattern is genuinely starting to reverse, and they are starting to notice that actually things are getting a bit run down. We need to do some more things. I'm not sure yet what the evidence on this is telling us, really. But they do expect that that the labels have gone funny, are going to make public services worse. 25% think they'll make them better. 40% think they'll make them worse. And I guess, given some of the spending pressures we're likely to be under, they're probably right. How are you doing? I thought this was fascinating. This is asking people just satisfaction of a range of things. I'm sorry for the busy slides, but sports and leisure centres, 86% satisfied. Parks, 86%. Libraries, 85%. Recycling, 82%. NHS down slightly, but actually everything else, looking where I've got long-term time series, is very, very solid. Lower ratings for social care, of course, but it always is. Don't take offence. It's simply that many people don't know enough about it to judge. But overall, these numbers are not showing any sort of precipitous collapse, and that's been the same pattern that I've been reporting back to you for the last few years. So the public hasn't noticed it yet. Now, it may be that this is because you're getting ever more clever, ever more skillful at judging the budgets, or indeed perhaps persuading them that times is hard and we're working incredibly hard on your behalf. Remember, last year we discussed how much of the cuts the public believed had happened. In 2012, they believed that 40% of the planned spending cuts had already been achieved in 2012. By 2015, that figure had fallen to only 28%. So people are accepting that perhaps the cuts haven't happened yet, that they are coming, but they're pretty positive about most public services. And indeed, when we ask people, do you think the public sector is better at providing services or worse than the private sector, or is there no difference? Back in 2004, 36% said the public sector was worse than the private sector. Now, in 2016, we actually have it pretty much even Stevens. 42% say no difference, but 30% now say it's better. It's gone from 20 saying it's better to 30% saying it's better, and only a quarter of the population now say yes, oh, the private sector obviously knocks the public sector into a cocked hat. And given the drive for efficiency and productivity in public services, it's nice to see that recognition. And looking at this, you know, what do you think about what you get from public service? Does it exceed your expectations, or is it short of expectations? And again, 5% in 1998 said it exceeded your expectations. That's now risen to 18%. And I know times are hard, but this is, if we think back to some of the things that used to go on 20 or 30 years ago, and we've all seen it, things have fundamentally changed. British, as Tony Travers likes to say to you, British public services are now some of the most efficient and effective in the world. And I thought that was fascinating. And overall, trust. Sorry, my labels have gone funny, but 43% of people trust local councillors, ahead of managers in local government at 37%. And judges, of course, are up here. Journalists are down here. And pollsters, I'm afraid I've got some new data. It'll be published shortly that shows that we've fallen a little bit, but only a little. We're still doing better than trade union officials or managers in the NHS. Sorry, I think the charts are just thinking, or they're changing them for me. So, generally, the 5 best-rated professions in Britain are all public sector: doctors, teachers, judges, and hairdressers. I thought that was interesting. It's interesting that people trust hairdressers, and I had many queries about this, but of course the reason people trust hairdressers, these are people who are, next to you with sharp knives, hot tools, they're actually also the happiest profession. If you ever get fed up of politics or local administration, hairdressing is actually the happiest profession of all. You do your job, you see your happy customer, you go home. You don't start worrying about the budget or your colleagues or other people in the cabinet or, or the whatever Whitehall's cooked up for you late. It's very straightforward. And of course, estate agents and government ministers remain here. Politicians are about to fall, I'm afraid, post-Brexit to 15%. So, but you're local councillors, so it's okay. So. And actually, when we ask whether the public sector sort of matches up, in terms of understanding your needs, it's now pretty much about the same. Challenge is still on listening to you and personalised service, involving you as good as the private sector, but certainly this sort of personalisation and being seen to listen. Things that I've talked to you about, or we've talked about hundreds and a lot, the more you can explain what you're doing to consult people, the better things will be. The more you said that we listened to you and you said this. Of course, when we say one of the problems with the public, of course, you listen to them and tell you lots of different things, and then it's you have to make a decision. But overall, I think the public sector is performing pretty reputably. Building things. This is obviously one of the challenges that Theresa May has set Mr. Javid, and indeed the British are very keen on. 88% of people in this country believe there is a housing crisis. We have a large proportion of people in the private rented sector, the vast majority of whom want to own their own homes. But of course, home ownership in Britain is now falling, and a large majority of our young people, the under 40s, now say they will never be able to afford to buy a house. Meanwhile, rents keep rising, and we don't seem to get things done. What's interesting when we look at devolution is that housing is the #1 thing that they want you to decide on. So when we ask the public what decisions should be taken nationally for England as a whole, or which decisions should be taken locally, #1 for national decisions is the welfare system, big infrastructure like Heathrow, but locally, I think it comes up, whoops, no it doesn't, locally it will be new housing, bus services. They'd like you to be in charge of education rather than the centre. Crime and indeed crime and policing, like the good old days, eh? And then obviously major decisions, welfare benefits, health issues. But housing, you should decide, not those people down in Whitehall or somewhere else. Now, of course, local communities won't always agree on that, but generally I think the consensus in Britain is that we're not doing brilliantly on infrastructure. So overall, how do you think we're doing? 28% say they're unhappy, 37% say they're happy, lots of people sort of split. We're pretty lukewarm, but they do want to be consulted. Local communities' views on plans for infrastructure should be heard properly, even if it means delays. And there, of course, we can find only 6% who disagree. Now, this is a challenge if you're trying to get things built, because there's always going to be, in a small and relatively crowded island, somebody who doesn't like it. But that sense of being talked to, again, communicated with, remains as a key challenge, and particularly demonstrating that you have listened. And indeed, when I look at my private sector clients like Google or Apple or Virgin Trains, you name it, one of the key drivers of their reputations, which they spend millions and millions on, is, of course, the amount of effort that the organisation is seen to make when it deals with customer problems and complaints. And being, personalised responses, showing that you've listened, really, really matters. When you're under the cosh, when your planning departments are under huge pressure, that's a challenge, but they want to be seen to be consulted. And those of you that are able to get that right, to carry off that difficult balancing act, might get some sympathy. We agree in Britain that housing supply is poor. 58%. And interestingly, in the long-running British Social Attitudes study, which goes back to the 1970s or before, support for more house building where I live, in my neighbourhood, has started rising now for the first time in that series of surveys ever. People are starting to acknowledge that the problem is so severe we need to do something about it. Now, whether we'll manage it, prefabs, borrowing money somehow, state investment somehow, beating up developers somehow, who knows? But certainly that challenge is there. Nevertheless, with all of these challenges, with you balancing the books and obviously the amount of road for easy savings having run out some time ago, it's interesting to see that British confidence is still relatively high. When we ask people the best things about the British, what would you say they were, ladies and gentlemen? What are the finest things about this country? NHS. The NHS, okay. Well, the top one is actually our great sense of humour. Then we have our politeness and good manners, our tolerance, interestingly. I like this, keep themselves to themselves, sort of law-abiding, But generally we think we've got a pretty good sense of humour, we're sort of fairly polite, tolerant, etc. Now, what are the very worst things about us as people, would you say? More? Drink too much. Now, drink too much, whinging, lazy, too nationalistic. This one, I'm sorry the label's dropped off, is ignorant of other cultures, which is interesting. So, I don't know. But we know our problems. However, we are still much prouder to be British than anything else. There's 5% of us who strongly disagree that I'd rather not be a citizen of Britain. Everybody else, 31%, strongly agree I'd rather be a citizen of Britain than any other country on earth. 29%. So we've got a great sense of humour. We're going to be a bit drunk, but we're going to be fine as we get through Brexit. And I think that will, that sense of humour may be necessary in the next few years as we juggle some of these priorities. But the challenges, I think, remain the same. People want leadership. It's why. I'm not suggesting any of you want to become like Donald Trump, but it is the offer of somebody who might actually do something different. To get us out of things that's important. They want to know what you're doing. When I compare your different authorities, there is no difference in how happy officers are with their pay when I compare performance. There is no difference whether people think people are friendly. You're all friendly. The biggest difference between stronger and weaker councils is how well-informed people feel they're being kept, both internally and externally, and of course confidence in the vision and the sunning up plans that people like you have to offer, that where we're going in our particular places that make England still probably just about one of the greatest countries on earth. The end. Thank you.
Thank you. I haven't got my glasses on, so if I get your name or get your sex wrong, I apologise in advance. Yeah. Well, Madam, what would you like to ask?
Sandy Martin from Suffolk County Council. Reading the very small print at the bottom of your charts, Ben, and I'm sure you would urge everybody to always read the small print. I noticed that several of them said sample taken age 16 to 65. Now, we all of us know, and especially those of us who are campaigning to remain in the European Union, just how important the votes of people aged over 65 are. Why do you only sample 16 to 65?
Well, obviously in election polls, we interview everybody, including people well over 100, and that's why we continue not to do them online, because there are still 15% of people in this country who are literally not connected to the internet. And indeed, in terms of functional access to the internet, that figure is probably even larger. The reason you see that there is simply the grim economics of the market research industry. You don't have any money, really, very often for opinion polling on any routine basis anymore. And interestingly, people like Unilever and Procter & Gamble, who are the main funders of market research globally, they, and I'm afraid it's looking at some of the audience, you might be disturbed to hear this, they don't care about people over 65. Because they believe that you aren't going to change your tastes in products and services. And so most online research, which is how most market research happens all over the world, now tends to exclude older people because it's simply being done online. And so that's why. But absolutely, we still, and in fact, if any of you need a bit of spare money, I am desperate for people to knock on doors. I have more demand for knocking on doors than I've ever done. And as you know, those of you who knock on doors politically, it can be a challenging job, but we have desperate demand for face-to-face interviews because the government and the media still want that. But yeah, that's a long answer to a short question.
Right, who's another question then, please? They're very quiet here. Could I ask one about, obviously we represent rural areas. I just wonder whether you do any polling in the differential between attitudes in cities and rural areas.
Well, of course. So, you know, the big issues for you are always road maintenance, access, you know, and then, of course, around the country, you've got then your own little different housing crises to that of London and the southeast. But overall, I mean, I think what's fascinating, and I don't know what the mood is, because I'm sorry I've only just arrived, but, you know, I am still really impressed. If we think about how we might have been feeling in 2010 about the size of the scale of the cuts, the NHS, you know, it is pillage and waste in the NHS at the moment. They are, you know, absolutely aghast at, you know, they've only had small real terms rises recently, etc. Now, admittedly, a lot more people are showing up than they would have ever expected for all sorts of reasons. But it is impressive in terms of the scale of what you've done. In some ways, of course, now, and this is when we really start to get tested, because now, of course, budgets are getting ever tighter. I don't think there's going to be a lot more money, unless you were given some hints of it. Maybe a bit more flexibility. But so far, you know, things have held up really, really well. And rural Britain is not, is not a sort of feeling that it's massively losing out compared to urban areas, or at least no more than in the past. Any more for any more? Yes.
One down there as well.
Thank you. Peter Martin from Surrey County Council. You've talked about America and nativism. What about the position in Europe and with Germany and France with elections next year and the very strange things that are happening there and the degree to which it's going to affect Brexit negotiations?
Well, I think obviously a potential change of leadership and stance is likely to be an issue. We don't believe that Marine Le Pen is going to win in France, although, you know, France has changed. It used to be, in terms of French opinion polling, that the way we measured the National Front support in opinion polls was to take whatever people told us in an opinion poll and then double it, because people were inhibited about saying that they were going to vote for it. That doesn't happen anymore. It's the same with UKIP. I was very worried in 2015 that I would be massively undercounting UKIP because people wouldn't want to tell my nice telephone interviewers that they were voting for UKIP. That didn't happen. So I don't have a crystal ball that will tell me what will happen in the French and German elections, but I think, you know, all across Europe, 48% of Italians would like their own referendum on membership of the European Union. The Germans and the Swedes are aghast at Britain leaving and are very, very anxious. The French, interestingly, and I speak as somebody who sold his business to a Frenchman, you know, it's just like, the French and the Belgians believe that Britain should be punished. And so, you know, and I'm not sure that's going to change, even if there is I don't believe that, necessarily Sarkozy will win in France, but I'm not sure that. I think we will still have to be punished as far as the French are concerned.
Yes, well.
Thank you. The elephant in every room like this is the reform of the NHS.
Yeah.
Have you got any advice for us in terms of how we might nudge that public perception about our sacred cow of the NHS?
About the
sacred cow of the NHS?
Well, it is, you know, the standard phrase that Nigel Lawson is going to be famous for this. You know, we're now starting to talk about the closest thing we have to a religion. And there isn't any sign of that moving. And the difficulty is that they, I was fascinated with the STP plans where they were told not to tell you or just to email it to you about 5 minutes before they sent it to the Department of Health. And this was their idea of consultation and partnership. But of course, a skim reading of those things suggests lots of, closures, etc. But the actual reorganisation is a huge challenge. And to be honest, my advice to them is to be not to actually have anything to do with social care. Because it's just, although it's the right thing to do, politically it's an absolute disaster. If it becomes, my poor old mum, if she had a terrible time in the last year of her life, if that had been, but it was very difficult to find out who exactly was responsible. Lambeth Council seemed to have outsourced the entire service to people who like to smoke ganja in the garden, rather than actually looking after my mother. When I only found out about continuing care when one of your directors of social services told me about it, and I rang up the CCG and they said, "Oh, of course, sir." But I didn't feel cross with Jeremy Hunt. I think if suddenly it was integrated, I guess if it happens, it will suddenly be you. Now, it may be that will be fine, because again, people are still confused. There's still a large proportion of people who believe that your districts run the library service. Many, they're still there. Many people still believe that you run the benefits. Local government runs benefits because of housing benefit and various other things. So I think obviously it's the right thing to do. I think politically it's extremely problematic, simply because there is a massive shortage, and of course the living wage is not going to make any of that any easier. And actually stopping migrants coming to do these jobs is going to make that even harder. So I'm not sure if I was the government, I would be going for a sort of Andy Burnham style fully integrated service, and it's probably going to be all the sorts of things that you're doing now, behind the scenes, low level integration, joint pilots, joint working, etc., but not any sort of major transformation. And because ultimately part of the transformation is another of those things, along with council tax revaluation, that is somehow too difficult. We have to persuade people in this country to change their behaviour, to change how they regard their health. And in Britain at the moment, most people view their bodies as something, they wouldn't treat their cars like they treat their bodies. You wouldn't buy a car, expect to put any old fuel in it, not service it, and then expect it to last for 100 years. But that's what we do. Quite a lot of people treat their bodies like that. And so I think we've got a long way to go. But the more you can work, you can build those personal relationships with them and try and, they are under, the chief officers in this room may feel sometimes under the cosh. I tell you, you really do not want to be an NHS Trust chief executive, the sort of pain and fear coming from central government in those places. And that's who they're terrified of, unfortunately, not their patients. So some real challenges. But again, it will come down to what happens on the ground. It's going to come down to culture locally, I think, rather than any great wisdom, unsadly, coming out of NHS England, which looks like it's locked down into short-term measures, balancing the books and just hoping for the best.
Thank you. Got Kevin over there, just over there, and then two together.
Thank you, Kevin Bentley, Deputy Leader of Essex County Council. Ben, thank you. Another excellent, thought-provoking presentation. We enjoyed enormously. I just wondered, we're having a continual conversation within local government and to the government about directly elected mayors or not, what we think. Yeah. Have you asked the public what they actually think? Repeatedly,
on behalf of some of the people in this room. I think the thing of elected mayors is people are not sitting around thinking in the pub in Chelmsford, thinking, oh, good, wouldn't it be great to have an elected mayor for Essex? They are not sitting there, or in the pub in Norfolk, or, or in Norwich, or, you name it. They're not sitting there thinking that. The bottom line is, on the other hand, they're not thinking, oh, those dastardly people in Whitehall trying to impose elected mayors all over Britain. I think one of the, just as an aside, I think, having seen some of the local debates about some of these packages and, these combined authorities that you might or might not get into, some of the, I suppose, local politics around that, unfortunately, probably confirms the prejudices that Whitehall holds about the worst aspects of local government, the sort of parochialism, etc. So, but the public, on balance, if you say there's an elected mayor and it means we get more cash, and it means although they can block the budget, they can't do anything on their own, they will tend to sort of think it's okay. This is not what we call a high salience issue. They're not up in arms. If you make it work, if you can make it work as a local political culture, and what's fascinating is that in each part of England, it's really only 200 or 300 people this is actually who are really involved with this. And it's up to you locally to make it work. If you get on well and can have a good culture locally, it will work, and if you don't, it will be horrible, as you know. But the public, frankly, are pretty unmoved. They believe that Boris has been a success for London, all over Britain, and actually in London. But obviously very, very large rural areas with very, very different centres of population, tradition, less concern. And I think, obviously the PCC elections give us a terrible warning about what might happen if you don't hold it on the same day as a general election, for this, yeah.
Okay, Roy. Yeah. Right. One last question, if anybody's got one. Yes, I've got one right at the back there.
Paul Hodgkinson, leader of the Lib Dem group on Gloucestershire County Council. I just wanted to ask you about the accuracy of polling, because obviously we saw in the referendum, as you yourself said, that you got that wrong, and that was a sort of spectacular one. But also going back 18 months, the general election, everyone was saying, it's going to be a hung parliament, and hey presto, the Tories won comfortably. So what work have you been doing to try and sort of alleviate some of those concerns?
I mean, the problem with polling, which we don't, and the newspapers don't really want to write about, is that a poll of 1,000 people is going to have a margin of error of about plus or minus 4%. So if I tell you it's 50%, then it could be 54, it could be 46, and it's probably most likely to be somewhere in between. And 5 times out of 100, so if you see hundreds of polls, 5 times out of 100, the margin of error will be larger, even if the poll is conducted perfectly by God himself, would still be even less accurate than that. We don't communicate that very well. In the general election, actually, we said the Liberal Democrats would get 8%, and you got 8.1% of the vote nationally. We said that UKIP would get 11, they got 12 point something. We said that the Conservatives would get 36, and they got 37.7. They were all fine. We overstated Labour by 3.5%, which is why we were coming in at 35 Labour, 36 Conservative, looking like hung parliament territory. Nothing much I can do that. The referendum in Scotland, I said 47-53, so it was 55, We're looking at it, but ultimately it does come down to money. The exit poll that we do for the election is generally very, very accurate. That costs £200,000. I think in America, what was interesting with the referendum polling was that 1 or 2 pollsters actually predicted a Leave win. The horror for me was that my raw numbers had a Leave win, 51% for Leave. But I was worried about what had happened at the general election. And so I looked at the data, and what we had done after the general election was try and deal with this overclaim by working class people mostly, to say that they were certain to vote tomorrow and then not actually do it. And about 2 or 3 in the general election, younger people, working class people, nearly all, said that they were going to vote tomorrow and then didn't. So of course we thought, we'll make some changes that adjust for that. And we added an extra filter, so you had to say, not only do you always vote, are you 9 or 10 out of 10 likely to vote tomorrow in the referendum, but you also have to answer a follow-up question which says, do you always vote in elections, or do you just usually vote? And that had the effect of knocking out 2 or 3% of the people who were, in this case, older and working class, who are the most, and this is a challenge for Labour, and for any Labour members in the room who are Remainers, the strongest group for leaving the European Union were older, working class people. 90% of those people wanted to leave the European Union. Of course, they didn't always vote, but they did then. And that is what will upset the polls in America. If suddenly a load of people, given that turnout in America was only 58% in 2012, already before the polls had opened in Florida this morning, more people had voted postally on cast votes than had cut the entire electorate of Florida previously. So that will be the upset. But, I think this is the great challenge, and it applies actually to you doing your budgets. We all have sacred cows. We had confirmation bias. We couldn't believe that the public were not going to do what happened in Scotland, which was swing at the last minute from 54% for Leave in our polling for the Cabinet Office, which we were doing on a daily basis, to 55% Remain in Scotland. And it happened. We saw it. We didn't catch it quite, but we showed clearly that they weren't going to leave. We believed, as a result of that experience, We sort of believed, and the entire polling industry was looking, and this is the problem, we were looking for evidence that there was going to be a swing to Remain in the referendum, and we were wrong to do so. And it's always, and this applies, whatever set of numbers you're looking at, and this is, Professor Tetlock is very good on this, find someone who really doesn't give about them and get them to make the tough decisions, because we're all too invested in it. So that's the challenge. But that margin of error is something that we don't talk about enough. And there won't be a fuss. I can tell you now one thing: you will not be complaining at me about the opinion polls at the next general election in Britain. Even if they're 4 percentage points out, it won't matter, because Jeremy Corbyn is not going to win. When it's very close, that's when it flows in, and that's where sort of a small systematic bias, because we've misjudged turnout, which is always the big problem, can be a challenge. But it is absolutely an art, and you're very welcome to come and watch, take part, or offer advice, and lots of people do. Thank you.
Okay, well, as always, very instructive and entertaining. Ben, would like to thank Ben for getting us going this morning.